At the end of the 19th century, three completely different objects might have been lying on the table of a Jewish family somewhere near Odessa, Vilna, Warsaw, or Kishinev. A prayer book containing ancient words about the return to Zion, a steamship ticket to America, and the latest newspaper debating socialism, Jewish autonomy, and the future of Palestine. This is not a literary invention. It is an accurate reflection of the historical choice faced by millions of Eastern European Jews. After the assassination of Emperor Alexander II in 1881, a wave of anti-Jewish violence swept through the southern and western provinces of the Russian Empire. The pogroms of 1881 to 1884 destroyed homes, shops, and the illusion that education and loyalty alone could guarantee safety. The pogroms were followed by new restrictions, including the so-called May laws. For countless families, the question was no longer abstract. Where would their children live if their right to a normal life depended on the will of an official, a policeman, or an enraged mob? But why, among all the possible answers, did the idea of returning to the land of Israel acquire such political power? After all, most Jews who left Eastern Europe were not heading for Palestine. They went to the United States, Britain, Argentina, and South Africa. Others believed in revolution. Some joined the Bund, a Jewish socialist movement that demanded rights and cultural autonomy in the places where Jews already lived. Some hoped for assimilation. Others remained within the traditional religious world. Eastern European Jewry never spoke with a single voice. And yet it was from this argumentative, impoverished, educated, traumatized, and extraordinarily active world that many of the people emerged who created the early political, linguistic, labor, and military framework of the future state of Israel. Modern Israel grew not only from the ancient memory of Zion, it also grew from Eastern European experience, fear of pogroms, party meetings, Hebrew and Yiddish newspapers, socialist circles, debates about dignity, and the habit of creating committees, schools, mutual aid funds, and self-defense organizations. To understand this contribution, it is necessary to follow a chain of causes and consequences: pogroms, Zionism, aliyahs, land, Hebrew, institutions, self-defense, and then to see how all these links came together in the creation of a state, and why, even after that, the history remained far more complicated than any beautiful national legend. Before continuing, support this episode with a like and subscribe to the channel. What matters here is not loud praise or convenient propaganda, but honest Jewish history, with all its achievements, mistakes, arguments, and human costs. Where the chain began. The first link was located not in Palestine, but in Eastern Europe. In the Russian Empire, millions of Jews were restricted to the Pale of Settlement, a vast but nevertheless forcibly defined territory beyond which permanent residence was prohibited or severely restricted for most Jews. The shtetls were full of life. Synagogues, craft workshops, schools, charitable societies, libraries, theaters, newspapers, religious courts, and political circles. This was not a grey corridor of endless poverty. It was an entire world. But that world was vulnerable. A Jew could be educated and still encounter a quota. He could open a shop and see it destroyed in a single night. He could speak Russian or Polish better than many of his neighbors and still remain a person whose right to belong was constantly questioned. After the pogroms of 1881, some Jewish thinkers reached a painful conclusion. The problem could not be reduced to one bad czar, one violent mob, or one discriminatory law. As long as Jews remained a minority without political power of their own, their security could be taken away from them. This created a new tension within Jewish life. The assimilationists said, Jews must become full citizens of the countries in which they live. The revolutionary replied, the entire social order must be transformed. The Bundists said, there is no need to leave. Jews must fight for their rights here, in Yiddish, among the workers of Eastern Europe. A religious Jew might reject secular nationalism or wait for messianic redemption. The Zionists said, even if equality could be achieved, the Jewish people still needed a national home of their own. None of these voices should be erased in hindsight. Zionism was not the inevitable choice of every Jew. It was one response to the crisis, but a response that gradually transformed from an idea into an organizational machine. Zionism did not create the Jewish connection to the land of Israel. That connection had lived for centuries in prayer, the calendar, sacred texts, rituals, mourning for the destruction of the temple, and the hope of return, long before modern nationalist movements appeared. But prayer and a political program are not the same thing. In prayer, one can say, "Next year in Jerusalem." A political program requires something else: convening a congress, establishing a fund, publishing a newspaper, seeking diplomatic support, purchasing land, preparing immigrants, debating the language of the schools, and answering the question of how society should be organized. This was where Eastern European experience became decisive. Jews from the Russian Empire, Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, Belarus, Romania, and Galicia lived during an age of mass political movements. They saw parties, underground circles, labor unions, revolutionary agitation, and the national revivals of Poles, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, and other peoples. They learned to think not only in terms of family and community, but also in terms of a movement. Even before Theodor Herzl's first Zionist Congress, there were Hovevei Zion societies, the lovers of Zion. In 1882, a conference of supporters of practical settlement in the land of Israel was held in the Romanian city of Foxani. Herzl gave political Zionism an international stage and a clear diplomatic form. But the ground had already been prepared by Eastern European circles, thinkers, and the first settlement organizations. Memory had become a plan. When the idea found its feet. The first aliyah, usually dated from 1882 to 1903, became the first major modern wave of Jewish immigration to the land of Israel. Most of the arrivals came from Eastern Europe, although the immigrants also included Jews from Yemen. They established agricultural settlements such as Rishon LeZion, Zikron Yaakov, Rosh Pina, and others. But the word pioneers can easily turn real people into bronze statues. In reality, many of them knew nothing about agriculture. They lacked money. The settlements depended on philanthropic support, especially funding from Baron Edmund de Rothschild. Crops failed. Administrators clashed with settlers. Disease devastated families. Some people left. The first aliyah was not a triumphant march. It was a school of mistakes. Yet those mistakes provided knowledge that could never have been acquired from newspaper articles. It became clear that purchasing land was not enough. Agronomists, water, roads, medicine, markets, security, schools, and people capable of enduring years of harsh uncertainty were also needed. The second aliyah, from 1904 to 1914, was relatively small. Approximately 35,000 people, mostly from Eastern Europe, together with a smaller group from Yemen. Many later left the country because they could not endure the conditions. Yet the political and cultural influence of this aliyah was far greater than its numbers might suggest. The newcomers included young people shaped by socialist ideas, Russian literature, Jewish tradition, and Zionist debate. They spoke of Hebrew labor, collective responsibility, and a new kind of person who would not only read and trade, but also work the land with his or her own hands. There was pride in this idea, but there was also complexity. It was intended to destroy the anti-Semitic image of the Jew as someone supposedly incapable of physical labor. It was meant to give the settlers economic independence. But the attempt to create a separate Jewish labor market sometimes meant replacing Arab workers and deepening the separation between the two societies. Palestine was not an empty land. It was inhabited by Arab farmers, urban residents, landowners, craftsmen, and Muslim and Christian communities. It was also home to the Jewish communities of the Old Yishuv in Jerusalem, Safed, Tiberias, Hebron, and other places. They included Sephardim, Arabic-speaking Jews, Jews from North Africa, the Ottoman Empire, Persia and the Caucasus, as well as Ashkenazi religious groups. The Sephardic community played an especially prominent role in the Old Yishuv. The new immigrants did not arrive in an uninhabited space. They entered a populated, multi-layered, and politically changing country. That is why the construction of the future Israel was connected from the very beginning not only with hope, but also with conflict. When the land stopped being a symbol. For a person from a shtetl, the words "Land of Israel" might have sounded almost like a line from a prayer. On the ground, however, they became heat, stones, mosquitoes, mud, debts, and exhaustion. Work began before sunrise. People had to dig trenches, carry stones, build roads and barracks, treat malaria, guard fields, and learn how to grow crops in an unfamiliar climate. In the valleys and marshy regions, the struggle against malaria became a matter of survival. At the same time, it is important not to repeat the romantic myth that the masters drained all of Palestine. These were specific projects in particular regions, not the miraculous transformation of an entire country by a single generation. In 1910, Haganah was founded and is generally described as the first kibbutz. A small group decided to live and work collectively, sharing income and responsibility. The kibbutz was not the only form of settlement and never represented all of Israel, but it became a laboratory of labor Zionism. Later, moshavim also developed, agricultural cooperative settlements in which families maintained more independent households. A new social ethic was taking shape in these communities. A person was responsible not only for his or her own home, but also for the kitchen, the kindergarten, the fields, the warehouse, security, and a sick neighbor. Decisions were discussed at meetings. The arguments lasted for hours, sometimes painfully long hours. The Eastern European habit of ideological debate did not disappear beneath the Galilean sun. Perhaps this was the only project in the world where people tried to build a cowshed, a new type of society, and the correct future of the entire Jewish people at the same time, and argued about all three at the same meeting. But behind the irony was something serious. The kibbutz allowed people who often had no capital to combine their resources. It created a network of mutual assistance and trained personnel for future political and military organizations. It is no coincidence that many commanders, ministers, and public figures came from the kibbutzim. Yet even then, the collective model did not suit everyone. Some left because of poverty, rigid discipline, or the absence of personal space. The country was not built by flawless heroes. It was built by people who doubted, argued, became ill, and sometimes gave up. A language in which people did not yet know how to ask for salt. The next domino may seem less dramatic than a pogrom or armed defense, but without it, a unified society might never have emerged. The immigrants spoke Yiddish, Russian, Polish, Romanian, Ukrainian, Lithuanian, and German. Sephardic families might speak Ladino, Arabic, or Turkish. Jews from Yemen, Iraq, Persia, and other regions brought their own languages and pronunciations. Hebrew existed as the language of prayer and sacred texts. But how could geography be taught in it? What words should be used for towel, bicycle, tomato, railway ticket, chemical element, or children's toy? How could a child from a Russian-speaking family and a child from a Sephardic family argue in the same language in the schoolyard? Eliezer Ben-Yehuda became the symbol of the revival of spoken Hebrew. He was born in Lithuania, arrived in Jerusalem in 1881, spoke Hebrew at home, published newspapers, worked on a dictionary, and participated in the creation of language organizations. But one person cannot revive a language for an entire society. Hebrew was made into a living language by teachers, students, parents, writers, editors, workers, doctors, actors, and children who began using it not only in the classroom, but also in arguments, love, trade, and everyday life. In 1889, Ben-Yehuda and his associates established the Safa Berura Society, and the Language Committee was later created. In 1904, it was re-established at the initiative of the Teachers' Association because the schools required common words and rules. Teachers sometimes invented terminology during lessons, and the same concept could be called by different names in neighboring schools. The committee collected words from ancient texts, created new ones, and borrowed and adapted forms from other languages. The revival of Hebrew was not the miracle of a single genius. It was the result of decades of coordinated work. Language connected individual settlements into a common public sphere. Newspapers were published in Hebrew. Party meetings were conducted in Hebrew. Children were educated in Hebrew. Later, military commands, government documents, and parliamentary debates would all use the same language. Without a common language, Jewish communities could live alongside one another. With a common language, they had a chance to become one society. Not a uniform society, but one capable of speaking within a shared political home. Organizations, instead of waiting. After the First World War, the next link appeared. The Ottoman Empire disappeared, Palestine came under British rule, and the Balfour Declaration of 1917 announced support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, while also stating that nothing should be done to prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities. The wording was brief, but the contradictions contained within it were immense. The third aliyah, which began after the war, brought new halutzim, pioneers, many of whom had survived revolutions, civil war, and pogroms. They created road-building battalions, labor organizations, settlements, and political structures. This was where the Eastern European legacy became especially visible. These people knew how to create a political party from a single room and a printed leaflet, how to organize a fund, how to elect a committee, how to argue about a political program until midnight, how to keep minutes, how to transform an idea into discipline. We have now reached the middle of this story. And if this examination is helping you see the past beyond familiar slogans, write in the comments which link in this chain has surprised you the most. Support the episode with a like and subscribe so that you do not miss the next documentary stories. In December 1920, the Histadrut, the General Federation of Jewish Labor, was founded in Haifa. It was not merely a trade union in the narrow modern sense. The Histadrut created jobs, medical institutions, cooperatives, construction enterprises, cultural institutions, and an entire economic network. David Ben-Gurion was one of its founders and became its general secretary in 1921. Representative bodies of the Yishuv later emerged, along with independent schools, municipal structures, a healthcare system, political parties, funds, and administrative departments. In 1929, the expanded Jewish Agency for Palestine was formally established. It became the central body representing the Jewish population before the British authorities and dealt with immigration, diplomacy, education, and other areas. It was led by Chaim Weizmann, a native of the shtetl of Motal and the future first president of Israel. There was still no state, but there were already departments, budgets, elections, trade unions, schools, healthcare funds, newspapers, diplomatic representatives, and armed organizations. This is the central turning point of the story. Two Eastern European Jews brought more than people and ideas. They brought a model of construction. The party, the school, the labor union, the cooperative, the newspaper, the committee, the fund, defense, and language. They were not only building houses, they were building a system. Conclusion. For many Eastern European Jews, the word self-defense carried a specific memory. During pogroms, the government authorities could arrive too late, remain passive, or actively support the violence. At the beginning of the 20th century, Jewish self-defense units were formed in several cities of the Russian Empire. They could not eliminate anti-Semitism, but they changed Jewish psychology. Jews were no longer required to wait for someone else to decide whether they deserved protection. The circumstances in Palestine were different, but the conclusion was similar. The settlements were located far apart. The Ottoman authorities, and later the British authorities, were not always able or willing to guarantee security. The growth of Jewish immigration and land purchases changed the lives of the Arab population, intensifying fears about the loss of land and political prospects. Resistance to the Zionist project grew. Attacks, reprisals, riots, and cycles of violence followed. In 1907, a small group of Eastern European Jews created the secret organization Bar Giora. In 1909, it developed into Hashomer, the Watchman, which guarded Jewish settlements. Its members included Alexander Zaid, Israel Shoshet, Manya Shoshet, and Yitzhak Ben Zvi. In 1920, the Haganah was established. It gradually became the principal military organization of the Yishuv. The training of personnel, communications, intelligence, the acquisition and production of weapons, and later the experience gained by Jewish volunteers during the Second World War, created the foundation upon which the Israel Defense Forces were formed in 1948. But the history of the Haganah cannot be reduced to a romantic image of watchmen sitting beside a campfire. The organization evolved and participated not only in defensive actions, but also in offensive operations. Alongside the Haganah were the Irgun and Lehi, more radical underground organizations that used terrorism and political violence against British authorities and the Arab population. Their ideology and tactics differed from those of the Labour Zionist leadership. Ze'ev Jabotinsky, who was born in Odessa, became the founder of revisionist Zionism and one of the leading opponents of the socialist camp. He emphasized the necessity of military strength and a more explicit commitment to statehood. David Ben-Gurion, who came from Pronsk, built the mass institutions of the labor movement. Their political camps fought bitterly over power, economics, Britain, and the acceptable methods of struggle. Eastern Europe gave the future Israel more than one idea. It gave Israel a political argument. That is what the word proto-state means. Not yet a state on the map, a state embedded in habits. The faces of the Eastern European framework names matter here not as objects of worship, but as evidence of diversity. David Ben-Gurion of Ponsk built labor institutions and became the central figure in the Declaration of Statehood. Chaim Weizmann of Motal combined science with international diplomacy. Golda Meir, born in Kiev and raised in the United States, made her way from a kibbutz to the leadership of the country. Bel Katznelson of Babruisk shaped the culture of the labor movement. Yitzhak Ben Zvi of Poltava participated in self-defense and political organization. Ben-Yehuda from the Vilna Governorate became the symbol of the Hebrew revival. They argued over property, religion, military force, and borders. Eastern Europe brought not one model, but an entire political continent, left-wing and right-wing, secular and religious. In old photographs, the pioneers stand upright and stare into the camera as though they already know that they will prevail. A photograph does not show the parents who chose not to go, the sister who chose New York, the brother who joined the Bund, the grave of a child who died from disease, the debt, the return ticket, the letter that one day stopped arriving. Many immigrants could not endure the conditions and left. Between the dream of the land of Israel and life in a tent lay a distance that ideology alone could not overcome. No one had any guarantee that the project would end with the creation of a state. Then came the destruction of European Jewry. Nazi Germany and its allies murdered millions of Jews, including a vast part of the Eastern European world from which the early Zionist leaders and pioneers had emerged. Shtetls, schools, publishing houses, synagogues, theaters, and families disappeared.
The new home was built by people who still remembered the old one.
And then, the old home almost ceased to exist. The Holocaust changed the meaning of the Zionist project, but it did not create it. The aliyahs, settlements, Hebrew language, institutions, and self-defense organizations had existed for decades before the Holocaust. The catastrophe revealed the terrible price of Jewish powerlessness and made the need for refuge urgent. On November 29, 1947, the United Nations General Assembly adopted Resolution 181, recommending the partition of Palestine into Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem placed under a special international regime. The Jewish leadership accepted the plan. The Arab leadership rejected it. War began between the Jewish and Arab populations of Mandatory Palestine, and after the declaration of Israel, the armies of neighboring Arab states entered the conflict. On May 14, 1948, Ben-Gurion read the declaration of the establishment of the State of Israel in Tel Aviv. But the declaration did not create a state out of nothing. Behind it stood decades of work: schools, hospitals, labor unions, diplomacy, settlements, a common language, political institutions, and armed forces. That was why the Yishuv was able to make the transition from a society without sovereignty to a state while fighting a war. For Palestinian Arabs, the war became the Nakba, the catastrophe of mass flight and expulsion, the destruction of communities, and the transformation of hundreds of thousands of people into refugees. The causes of the exodus varied from place to place: fighting, fear, expulsions, and the collapse of local order. In some cases, calls for evacuation were also made. Historians continue to debate the relative importance of these causes, but the scale of Palestinian displacement and the participation of Jewish forces in a number of expulsions are documented. An honest history of Israel does not require this tragedy to be erased. National memory becomes mature when it is capable of carrying the memory of another people, not only an Ashkenazi history. After the establishment of the state, it became especially clear how inadequate it was to see Israel simply as a continuation of Eastern Europe. During the first years of independence, Holocaust survivors arrived alongside hundreds of thousands of Jews from Iraq, Yemen, Morocco, Libya, Egypt, Syria, Iran, Turkey, and other countries of the Middle East and North Africa. Jews later arrived from Ethiopia, the Soviet Union and post-Soviet states, France, and Latin America. They did not enter a completed home as guests. They became its builders. Sephardic and Middle Eastern Jewish communities had existed in the land of Israel before the first modern Zionist aliyahs. Yemenite Jews participated in the early settlement movement and labor economy. After 1948, mass immigration transformed a small state into a society of millions. But the transition was painful. The early institutions were controlled primarily by the Ashkenazi elite of labor Zionism. New arrivals from Muslim countries were often placed in transit camps and peripheral development towns. Their languages, music, and religious traditions could be treated as less modern. The attempt to create a single nation sometimes became pressure to abandon family cultures. This does not negate the achievements of the early Yishuv, but it demonstrates the danger that emerges when one image of the new Jew is declared to be the only legitimate one. The Eastern European pioneers wanted to create a Jew who spoke Hebrew, worked the land, could defend himself, and place the collective above older divisions. There was an emancipatory impulse in this vision, but contempt for weakness could become contempt for the diaspora. The desire for unity could become pressure against diversity. The desire to build modernity could become arrogance toward those whose modernity looked different. The building of a country is not an icon. It is power, mistakes, ideals, sacrifices, and decisions whose consequences are judged by later generations. What exactly did they build? We can now return to the central question. How did Eastern European Jews help build modern Israel? Not because they were somehow better than other Jews. They became an early mass force within modern Zionism and brought several elements that came together to form the framework of a state. They transformed the anxiety of a minority into a national program. They created parties, labor unions, cooperatives, schools, and funds. They helped turn Hebrew into the everyday language of a modern society. They established settlements in which mutual assistance, mobilization, and local government were developed and tested. They drew from the experience of pogroms the conviction that Jewish security should not depend entirely upon the power of others. They produced leaders capable of conducting negotiations, raising funds, absorbing immigrants, and declaring a state at the decisive moment. But they also brought rigid ideological divisions, party monopolies, and at times contempt for the cultures of Middle Eastern Jews. Their legacy can therefore be described as neither flawless nor accidental. It remains visible in modern Israel, in its noisy parliament, the central role of the military, powerful public institutions, kibbutzim, a shared language, and an endless debate between the collective and the individual, religion and the secular state, the center and the periphery. A ready-made Israel did not arrive from Eastern Europe. What arrived was a machine capable of building it. What is important to remember first? Modern political Zionism grew not only from pogroms, but the pogroms and restrictions made the question of security especially urgent. The ancient connection to Zion had existed for centuries, but at the end of the 19th century it acquired parties, funds, and a program of immigration and settlement. Second, the early aliyahs created not only settlements, but also the personnel of the future leadership. The second aliyah in particular, with approximately 35,000 arrivals, exercised an influence far greater than its numbers. Third, Hebrew was not revived by one person. Ben-Yehuda was an essential symbol, but the language became part of daily life because of teachers, families, newspapers, and children. Fourth, by 1948, the Yishuv already possessed the institutions of a proto-state: political representation, education, healthcare, economic organizations, and an armed force. Fifth, Israel was not built only by Eastern European Jews. The Old Yishuv, Sephardim, Mizrahim, Yemenite Jews, Holocaust survivors, and later aliyahs transformed the earlier framework into a many-voiced state. Everything began with a question that Eastern Europe posed with particular brutality. Could the Jewish future ever be secure if the right to exist always had to be requested from someone else's government? One answer led to America, another led to revolution, a third led to the Bund. The Zionist answer led to the land of Israel. There, memory became settlement. Settlement required labor. Labor required mutual assistance. Different communities required a common language. Society required institutions. Conflict required self-defense. Institutions and self-defense made statehood possible. This is how historical dominoes work. Eastern European Jews came from a world in which Jewish life was both rich and vulnerable. Shtetls, books, Yiddish, poverty, pogroms, political parties, dreams, fear, and hope. They brought more than pain from that world to the land of Israel. They brought a program. Work, speak Hebrew, build schools, create political parties, defend settlements, argue about the future, transform the memory of Zion into a political, cultural, and governmental reality. But modern Israel is not a monument to a single group. It is a country assembled from many Jewish worlds and created in a land where another people was already living. Mature memory must be capable of holding several truths at once: the dignity of the Jewish return, the necessity of Jewish security, the contribution of Eastern European pioneers, the tragedy of Palestinian Arabs, and the enormous role of Sephardim, Mizrahim, and later aliyahs. History becomes weak when it is reduced to a slogan. It becomes strong when it can withstand complexity. Eastern European Jews did not build Israel alone. But without their political energy, organizational culture, linguistic revolution, labor movements, self-defense organizations, and leadership, modern Israel would look very different. They helped prove that the Jewish people could do more than preserve the memory of a home. They could build a home again. Not a perfect home, not a home free from mistakes, but a home of their own, capable of receiving people from the destroyed shtetls of Europe, from Baghdad and Casablanca, from Sana'a and Addis Ababa, from Moscow and Paris. A home in which the argument never ended, because Jewish history did not end.